Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name's Marianne Rothman. I'm the Executive Director of the Council of New York Cooperatives and Condominiums, which is your host for tonight's webinar. We've been around since the 1970s when the rash of conversions of rental buildings to co-ops and then subsequently some to condos made people feel the need to learn things, to share experiences, etc. Our tagline says information, education, and advocacy. And 2021 has been a big year for advocacy, particularly in Albany, where things went wild. We spent a lot of time defending against legislation that would have over-controlled co-ops in our view, and so far we've been successful. Most importantly, the co-op condo property tax abatement was extended for 2 more years. And we have several other bills that we feel very positive about, but until they're signed into law by the governor, the way the co-op condo tax abatement bill has been, we're not going to even talk about them. Education's very important to us. We do classes like this on a regular basis. And this coming Tuesday, we have an interesting webinar on the lessons learned from the collapse of the condo building in Florida. One of our speakers' colleagues will be one of the speakers on that seminar. So our speaker for tonight is Dan Wurtzel, the president of First Service Residential, which is the largest management company that there is. And we kind of have a tradition with Dan now. This is either the 4th or the 5th time that Dan is presenting for us this wonderful webinar, onboarding new board members, which he invented for CNYC several years ago. It's a terrific class, both for the long-term board members who are orienting and onboarding the new board members and for new board members. And I've noticed that we have a nice mix of those in the registration for this class. This is a webinar, so we're going to ask you to put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to all the questions today. If we don't, we'll find a way to email answers to you. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dan Wurtzel.
Well, thank you, Marianne. I always appreciate being part of this. And I just want to mention that largest management company also means most successful. And so I started with this company 34 years ago when there were four of us, and now we've grown over time, obviously. But anyway, you know, every so often, and Marianne is correct, I've been doing this, you know, this is maybe my 4th or 5th or 6th time doing this, but every so often something happens in our industry that makes board members really open their eyes to what their responsibilities are and how important it is to take those responsibilities seriously. And obviously that is, you know, the most recent event is what happened with that building collapse in Surfside, Florida. And, you know, and I'm not here to point fingers, but understanding what board members really need to do and how important it is to act as a fiduciary to your buildings could not be more in focus than it is right now. So that's sort of my introduction to today. And as we, hold on one second, let me get to, okay, so this is what we're going to cover, all right? I don't have to read it to you. Everyone here, I'm sure, can read it. And, you know, maybe it's like 5 minutes per segment. But if you have a question during any of the segments, ask it. And I'd like to answer it in the contents of while we're discussing that segment, because I think it just makes more sense to, you know, for everyone to hear the answer to that question while we're talking about that particular issue. Okay, and again, use the Q&A feature, because that's what I'm looking at. If you use the chat feature, I'm not looking at that, and neither is Mary Ann, and we'll miss it. Okay, so really just we're going to start at a macro level, and then we'll work our way into the more granular things that you as board members need to really pay attention to and look at very closely. But here's what co-ops and condos must do, right? We provide services, amenities to owners. You want to protect property values. That pretty much sums it up, okay? And our owners, okay, which obviously shareholders or unit owners, abide by the governing documents and policies. They have to meet their financial obligations, maintenance, common charges, assessments, whatever their other charges are, okay? Sounds easy, all right, but it does get a lot more complicated. All right, so, and again, this is, 101. So for some of you, it may be, oh, yeah, I know this. And for some of you, it's like, yeah, I think I know this, but I think it's worth repeating. The Bible for co-ops and condos are what you see here. Proprietary lease, that is a lease, obviously, between the shareholder and the co-op. A declaration in a condo, which is not signed. It's in the offering plan. And then you have bylaws and house rules. The bylaws and house rules are contained within the proprietary lease. In the condominium, it's not, there's just a condo deed. But that's really that's the meat and potatoes of what you as board members need to look at and understand. Those are the governing documents. So we're getting a little more granular. So as board members, okay, you're responsible for making decisions and setting policy. I've seen in many occasions where board members, do managing agent tasks for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to get into that, but this is what you're responsible for doing as a board member, okay? And your decisions are all around protecting the interest of the property and the owners, to maintain and enhance all common areas and improve the quality of life for all residents, okay? Pretty macro, all right? And I wish it was that easy, but it's not, as we know. All right, here's the word fiduciary obligation or responsibility gets kicked around. That word gets kicked around probably the most in when you talk about board members. And look, a fiduciary is just acting in the best interest. And it's important to know that. It's important to take off your shareholder unit owner hat and put on your co-op and condo hat when you're participating as a board member. Duty of ordinary and reasonable care, okay, and it's a simple concept, right? You do what basically a reasonable person would exercise. That's you're using reasonable judgment, okay? Speaking of judgment, okay, the business judgment rule, which is the standard that boards are held to when they're making a decision, assuming they're being fiduciaries and they're using duty of ordinary and reasonable care. And there is this thing about, well, if we do something now, we're setting a precedent. You can make a decision today, and then 2 years from now, you can make a contradictory decision to that decision from today because it makes more business sense, okay, in 2 years from now. Things change in our world, as we have seen, and you use business judgment and duty of ordinary and reasonable care to make decisions. And this is not like a Supreme Court decision that once you make it, it's set in stone forever. All right. And the last thing is, as an obligation, is just confidentiality. All right. not to discuss the matters of what goes on in these board meetings outside of the board meetings. Okay, you may discuss amongst each other, but not with your neighbor, not with another group of people in the building, because you want to keep them updated. That's not the way to keep owners updated. So that's another sort of your duties and obligations. Okay, now we get into the role, and this is where things get, again, more micro. You got to educate yourself on basically what I'm doing. Okay, we are now going to do this for our boards if they want to. Okay, so because we want educated board members, understanding what your role is of a board, knowing that even if you were the president of the board or any kind of officer or even a board member, you cannot make decisions as an individual. Decisions need to be made by the board. All right. And I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that, when you are making decisions, you got to put aside your shareholder unit owner hat and put on, hey, what's best for the building? All right. Just these other things are just kind of like keeping focus. All right. Have the lens on, what your responsibilities are. I hate to say adhere to legal and ethical obligations. I mean, that's to me a given, but sometimes there are board members who have conflicts of interest as board members and doing business that for the building. And there are certain ways that needs to be addressed. There's obviously a conflict of issues requirement that you have to disclose to all owners now, but understanding what that means. And, there are things that, seem really pressing with board members, we need a rule for that. We need a rule for this. And really, it's just, you got to try to strike a balance between what you really need to do for the entire building as opposed to, okay, we got this issue right now, let's create rules around it. And the other thing is really be open to compromise, because I think that is, really important. And you can't always get your way, and you have to be open-minded and just, and be flexible. So let me continue to move on. All right, so, the officers of a board are basically positions that don't give the individuals any more power. Okay, there doesn't mean that their votes or what they want to do is weighted more. It just, in a corporate structure, you need to have officers. Okay, and this is what the officers' responsibilities are. All right, I didn't really see any questions around this other than, will we be sending the slides to everyone? Marianne, I leave that up to you. Okay.
If you're willing to share these wonderful slides, we will send them out. We are recording this session, and it will eventually be posted on the CNYC website, and Dan's staff has requested a copy also.
Okay, so those are the only questions that came up in
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. What does confidentiality cover? Do the shareholders have the right to know how the board voted on an issue? And I'm going to ask the person who's writing in the chat to please put your future questions in the Q&A where we're supposed to be looking.
Okay, so there are two things. Let's say this is coming up soon, but tools to keep your owners informed. So, and I'm using owners to mean shareholders and unit owners. And one of them is the minutes, okay, which we do not recommend circulating because it's a record of the corporation or the association, and there is some level of confidentiality. It doesn't mean an owner doesn't have the right to see him, but we do not recommend, you know, distributing them. The next thing you know, they end up getting posted on the internet somewhere, and that's what you don't want. But you can let people know, your owners know, through regular communication. Okay, some buildings put out a communication after each board meeting, just giving them a summary of the important decisions that were made. It's not important for your owners to know how people voted. Okay, if you want your in a communication to owners, if you want your objection noted for the minutes, you can put that in the minutes. Okay, and it'll just say, you know, there was John Smith requested that his objection be noted to the vote on this matter, and that's it. Okay, so I hope that satisfied the question. If not, please use the Q&A, and we can always go back to that. So I want to spend some time on the role of your property manager, your management company, because there is a clear line of what management should be doing versus what board members should be doing. Okay, so, you know, we're your partner. Okay, we're not your adversary. Okay, we are working for you. We are working for all the owners of your building, and to the extent that we can use tools that we have to facilitate that, that is obviously the objective. All right. The biggest part of this business, and to me the most important part of this business, is communication. Whether it's at the board level, whether it's at the owner level, whether we're dealing with, you know, sales and leases and communicating that way, that is critical. And so, you know, just board meeting preparation is a form of communication and getting it out to the board members in advance. You know, if you have to take minutes, we take minutes. Client services and support for unit owners. So one client service could be how we process alteration agreements and doing that in an effective and a communicative way. Another one is a sale or lease application. Board communication with residents and staff. You know, we should be putting out those types of communication with the board's consent, and obviously the content has to be agreed upon. Financial management, you know, budgeting is important. So we're responsible for creating the budget and managing the budget, and by reporting on the management of the budget at each board meeting. You know, what variances do we have? Why do we have them? And, you know, things that are significantly impacting that expense line item. All right. Collect assessments, provide you options for what you can do with your reserve money, as well as point out to you whether or not you need to start to pay attention to your reserves because you have significant capital work coming up. We manage accounts payable, we pay the bills and accounts receivable, and we work with the auditor to make sure that, you know, that the proper financial visibility is there. And so that's, you know, that's sort of the ABCs of property management. Under vendor management, we need to make sure that any vendor coming into your building, whether it's to, you know, fix a leak, you know, take care of the elevator or the exterminator, has the proper type of insurance. And because, you know, any kind of accident that happens in a building in New York State will ultimately fall on the buildings. It will ultimately be a building's responsibility if the vendor's insurance will not cover for one reason or another. And there's a whole, you know, ocean of, and I could spend a long time talking about that, but that is so important nowadays. And then, you know, working with your super resident manager and coordinating maintenance, activities, whether they're emergency, whether they're, you know, normal stuff that for service contracts and so forth. I do see a question. Should managing agent inform all board members in advance of workers coming to the building? I mean, you know, it's a very fluid situation, and I don't think that, my personal opinion, a board member needs to know if a plumber's coming, if the exterminator is coming to the building, the elevator service company is coming to the building to do their monthly review. However, if a plumber needs to come to a building and there's, because we need to have, and we need a water shut off, okay, yes, the board will know and will be advised in advance that, you know, we have an issue that requires a water shut off. If it's not an emergency, it can be scheduled. If it is an emergency, you know, you're hearing about it in real time. And so I hope that.
Again, there were two earlier questions before that one.
Okay. Oh yes, I do not see responsibility here of relationship of management company to the treasurer. Stay tuned. We're not there yet. We're going to get there. Okay. And is there additional sources on how to analyze reserves? Yes, for us there is. Okay. We have a whole banking section of our company that can do an analysis for you in terms of what you can do for your reserves. As far as it relates to whether or not you have enough reserves for future capital improvements, that's all around whether or not a study has been done. And certainly we can facilitate that. Let's see. Marianne would like to answer. Okay, no, I think that's taken out. Who was involved in negotiating the contracts between the contractor and building with capital issues like hallway renovations? I mean, that has to be done fully disclosed at the board level, okay? A bidding process has to be established, and then whoever your professional is that is overseeing that project is appointed as the individual who would be negotiating the contracts with, you know, an understanding to the board, okay, here are, you know, setting parameters, and the board has to be advised of that in advance.
Could we ask people to put their questions in the Q&A? We're getting more and more in the wrong places.
Does management recommend contractors, et cetera, or can it be done by board alone? Well, you know, we obviously know a lot of vendors who do work in buildings and they're qualified. The key is if board members want to use their own contractors, we just have to make sure that they're properly insured and they have the right coverage so that in case there is an accident, that the contractor's insurance will cover it. And that sort of is on this page. And the last question here, and then I want to move on. Financial info for shareholders. Is there another way to communicate with shareholders about upcoming capital expenses besides the annual financial statement that you would recommend? Yeah, look, I mean, if you know you're doing a hallway project, the planning of that hallway project from you know, the time you are talking about doing it until the physical work is actually done, there are so many steps and opportunities that can be used to communicate to your owners, you know, what the financial impact will be on the building. I think any owner would not be happy if they got a memo saying, okay, in August, we're starting our hallway project and it's going to cost $1 million and we're an assessment. I mean, that's not, as board members, that's not the right path to take. All right, let me move on and just continue with the role of the manager or management. And again, you know, these are things that we do. There's a whole human resource component of it. There's legal and regulatory and insurance matters. These are all, I don't have to go through each one of them, but our responsibilities over the years have significantly increased just around these two areas. There is so much regulation now and dotting of the I's and crossing the T's. And if you don't follow that, there is tremendous amount of liability that buildings can, have to inherit because of that. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. And again, we talked about communication. There are different ways to communicate. In most of our buildings, we can do like a mass comm, which is what resident alert is. We email, we can do text messaging, electronic newsletters, signage and flyers, and also the old-fashioned way of putting things under people's door, especially if it is something that requires immediate attention and there's not enough time for sending things out. As well as we can't expect everybody to be on email. Okay, so there are ways to make sure that residents who are not on email are getting the information, and we're not excluding that group of individuals. As I mentioned at the beginning, communication is really the foundation of successful management. And when we communicate with residents, okay, and we want to keep in touch with them, and we work with the board on this, okay, what do we want to accomplish with a communication? Who's the message directed to? When do residents need to receive this information? How timely things are, and is the communication clear, concise, and providing all the necessary information? So those are the four components of putting together a communication, and you want to make sure that whatever communications go out, and we are part of that process as well, that we're hitting on all four of these components. And I just want to, there's something around communication, financial, no. Does managing agent have a fiduciary responsibility? Just scroll down a little bit to the building. Absolutely. Okay, we act as your fiduciary, and in making decisions on certain operational matters, we're with you on that. Okay, so we're all traveling and using the same lane in terms of how we operate and what our responsibilities are. All right, now in some buildings, somebody said, do you have app-based, any recommendations for app-based alert software for emergencies? I'm not going to create a commercial for the products that are out there. I will tell you that our operating platform has this tool, so we're this is part of our SOP, and it is, and we use it constantly. All right, so I just want to move on to committees. Okay.
Could I suggest that we let Dan do the presentation? This is a class on onboarding new board members, and it's a very full class, and you're going off on a whole lot of tangents, and Dan is too gracious to not answer the questions. So I'm going to be the police. Let's all right,
thanks, Mary Ann. Okay. And by the way, these are all good questions, and I love answering them. So Mary Ann, I think the message goes to me as well. All right. Anyway, committees have certainly a value to buildings because whether it's a committee that reviews applications for sales and leases, or there's a committee that's formed for a hallway project. So you have ad hoc committees, which are task oriented, and they disband when the task is completed, such as a hallway project. And then you have standing committees, which are function oriented and remain in force indefinitely, like an admissions committee. There may be a newsletter committee. So, you know, now you don't have to create an entire bureaucracy, and just really depending on the size of the building and the demands of the board and decisions that need to be made, sort of guide whether or not you need committees. And just to kind of dig a little bit deeper, you know, committee duties vary, you know, depending on these items, okay? And a board can promote the success of a committee, you know, by really, it enhances participation, okay, in a building. And, you know, some people want to participate, but, you know, they can't get on the board, but they feel like they want to do something. And these are ways to get more people involved. It also grooms board members, okay? And I think that that's really important, because having succession plans and knowing that we're all not sitting in these positions forever, as much as we like to do it, and the pay's, you know, you're not doing it for the pay. You want to know, like, who's coming in next. So, you know, really, when you form these committees, you got to give them guidelines. They need to stay in their lanes and understand what they can do. And all they can do is recommend to the board, okay? Even a newsletter committee, okay? The board needs to approve it, all right? So the committees make recommendations, but ultimately the board has to approve it, even if it's the hallway project. Or, you know, the board has final say. Hopefully the committee and board are somewhat aligned. All right. Are committees made up of board members, or may they include shareholders? Actually, a board member should be chairing a committee, and then you would bring in other owners who are not necessarily board members. Otherwise, you're just duplicating the amount of work for your board, and it's not bringing in other owners to participate in helping run your co-op or condo. All right, let me move on. Board special and annual meetings. All right, and this is important, because I have seen boards at times go in thinking they can just wing it, and they're gonna get through it, and it's not going to be a problem. That's not a path that leads to a successful annual meeting. All right, you need to be organized, you know, and really understand how things flow at a meeting, so that it can be successful. But meetings, you know, let's say just at a board meeting, all you're supposed to be doing is making decisions, setting policy, and you're going to get review of issues. There may be some disputes, and, you know, you're planning for what you're doing next down the road. That's it. And I got to tell you, board meetings that run more than an hour and a half are what I would call inefficient board meetings, because that means that they're not doing this, okay? And maybe the reason why they're not doing this is because the preparation is not there, okay? So getting the board package in advance, if you have questions, send them in advance, and the managing agent or the board president, whoever's leading the meeting, is following the agenda, all right? And then there's an action plan of basically called a to-do list that is comes out of that meeting, and that is circulated to the board. And so it's really just from meeting to meeting, other than decisions, it's updates and it's new issues that may have come up. Special meetings, all right. or town hall meetings, okay? This is another form of communication, all right? You know, you may focus on one particular item. I know in condominiums, if you're doing a major capital expenditure, you may need authorization from the unit owners, majority of the unit owners, common interest to spend over a certain amount of money. It's also a way to set sort of the floor and get sort of pulling the train out of the station around controversial issues. Okay, you want to put through a transfer or flip tax. Okay, you want to make a change to the bylaws, or you want, you know, something like a proprietary lease expiration should be, you know, one of those things that in a co-op, if your lease is expiring within 30 years and you have banks that give 30-year mortgages to shareholders, there's going to be a red flag and you're going to have to make that change. Well, if you just say, hey, just do it, people aren't going to be receptive to it. They're not going to think it's important. This is the purpose of having a special meeting or a town hall meeting. And it gets the owners involved and they understand what's happening at the building. It also provides a venue for resident for feedback. Okay, one of the last things you want is, you know, not to keep your owners up to date on things, as I mentioned earlier, and you get to the annual meeting and it's like, you know, it just is painful. So that's what that's the purpose of special meetings. And then the annual meeting, this is the one that you have to have every year, and it really should be quick and easy and painless. And to the extent that you've done a good job, you know, communicating to your owners, that's the way it will go. And so, you know, the components of an annual meeting are just formalities of establishing a quorum. This is the fun. I always find this to be unbelievable that somebody is supposed to read the minutes of the prior annual meeting, but it's always waived. And then reports of your officers, whatever you're voting on, other than the election, you would talk about then, and maybe for the election, the nominees get an opportunity for a minute or two to present their qualifications. Election and Q&A. And if you've done all your homework, that Q&A is not painful. Okay, so just in terms of requirements for each type of meeting, okay, you know, between an annual meeting and a board meeting, you know, this is all found in your bylaws, okay? And these are just examples of what you are required to do for each type of meeting. For a special meeting, again, your bylaws will dictate what you need to do in terms of timing of notice, but you do not have to take minutes for a special meeting if you're not voting on anything. Okay, this is something that I referred to earlier, which is using common sense in putting together rules and policies. And, you know, these are the, you know, the criteria that needs to be sort of used to set house rules or making certain policies. And what you really want to be careful of is this policy good for the entire building? Or is it good because 3 shareholders or owners brought dogs into the building and we want to make sure that they are fined up the wazoo and we take away all their rights and so forth and so on. And, you know, you're going to use, in these kinds of situations, you want to use your corporate counsel to direct you around this, okay? And you will get very good advice from your corporate counsel. And so these are the do's and don'ts, which, you know, I was just referring to, you know, make sense. You know, they're needed. They will be accepted by the residents, and you don't want a rule that's going to require policing. Okay, it's very difficult to police rules that you have to hire them. You're going to have to hire the squad to walk around and catch somebody. So that's not realistic. So they need to be enforceable, and we have to make sure that they're legal. And again, don't do these things. And they're pretty, I think it's just common sense. All right. I'm just looking at the Q&A. How should an agenda be selected? How far in advance of board meeting should an agenda be chosen and board package be delivered to board members? So the agenda for the board should be, as I mentioned earlier, should be simple. Okay, it's it's reports, it's decisions that need to be made. It's basically looking at that task list or action list and putting it into the format for the board, and then any new things that come up. And what's the right amount of time? I would say like 4 or 5 days before. If it's too far in advance, then you may miss something. If it's too close to the board meeting date, then it doesn't give the board members time to look at it. I have found though that majority of board members look at it like 10 minutes before they walk into the board meeting. But for those who are looking at the information before, I would say 3, 4, 5 days in advance is enough. And if you only need 25% of the shares to have a special meeting, what is your recourse when the board tells you your issue is not of importance because only 25% of the shareholders are involved? This is, I think what you could do is go to your attorney, okay, and ask that question. You may be obligated to have a special meeting if the bylaws say 25% of the owners of shares or common interest are calling an annual meeting, or calling a special meeting. You may have to do it whether it's, whether the board thinks it's a nonsense issue or not. Okay, financial management, because we did have a question on that. So, as a fiduciary, and these are things that just don't apply to the treasurer, they apply to all board members. Okay, you're approving an operating budget, you're planning for the future, you're investing wisely your reserves, but you need to know. Ignorance is not is something that a board member should be claiming. So from an operating budget lens, it's the financial plan, understanding it, knowing what the components are of that, and the way you set your budget is you do your expenses first, and then you say, okay, this is what we need for on the revenue side, and that's how you back into whether or not you need a maintenance increase. And the most co-ops and condos, in a stable environment, financial environment, will have 2 to 3% increases annually. All right, that's just the way it goes, because the drivers, okay, are real estate taxes, which we know always go up, and for condos, obviously that's not in the operating budget. Labor, if you have a union building, and even if it's non-union, those wages and benefits become more expensive every year. And there are fluctuations in energy and water and sewer that need to go up. That's probably when you add in for co-ops your underlying mortgage, you're talking about close to 90 to low 90% of your operating budget. So when those components go up, you have to understand and make sure that you budget for that. And buildings should have a capital budget, and maybe for certain reasons like COVID, the schedule gets pushed out, but it should be updated. These are just things that we do for long-term financial planning. I'm not going to dig into it in depth because there's a lot here, but again, it's not just the treasurer's responsibility to do this. Okay, there can be a point person. Okay, but ultimately, every board member needs to understand what they need to do and plan for it. All right. On the compliance side, this has become what was an annoyance maybe 5 to 7 years ago to a monster. Okay. And I have 3 slides to just show you very quickly. These are all, most of this is new, some of it's not, but so for example, Local 11 is not new. It's been around for a while, but it has become more comprehensive and more detail oriented to protect the safety of the public as well as the integrity of your building. But issues around cooling towers, okay, if you have a central air conditioning system, inspecting gas piping, that's now required, so your building doesn't all of a sudden have an explosion, and that's that's the kind of thing that can really cause a great deal of damage and injuries and possible death. And buildings that are now going through this are finding out that they have to turn their gas off and replace gas lines. Indoor allergens such as mold and things like that. Lead-based paint for buildings that were built before 1960. We have bed bug requirements, and this is the next set. This energy conservation stuff is the new wave of compliance, and buildings and boards need to pay real close attention to this. This is not just checking a box. This is about the future of your building and how it's going to operate so that your carbon footprint is reduced significantly. Some buildings have to deal with this by 2025 and getting their building in compliance. So if your managing agent isn't on top, if you have a D on your building with your letter grade and your managing agent hasn't talked to you about it, get that on the agenda for your next meeting. All right, because the fines are incredibly steep. More stuff, fire and emergencies, sexual harassment training for all your building employees. These are all things that we now have to, file, make sure they're done. And that's on top of the window guard, lead paint notifications that are required every year. That's where this all started. So it's a bear. I mean, we have like a 7-person compliance department because of all these things. We used to have nobody because we were able to do this window guard and lead paint stuff electronically. No more. We still do the window guard and lead paint stuff electronically, but this requires a lot of manual labor. And around the Client Mobilization Act, which is the main energy law, this is sort of what it looks like going forward. And this is where you as board members, if you have a D on your building, you only have a few more years to come into compliance. Otherwise, you're at 2030. The 2050 date, I would say very few of you will be on the board in 2050, but you got to get the ball rolling now, because if you don't, we have buildings that have 6- and 7-figure fines if they do not comply, and that's on an annual basis. And so, we've given you tools, okay? We've given you, I call this a little bit of drinking from the fire hose, You can't necessarily absorb everything at once, but if you're just coming onto a board, these are some of this is like your checklist, okay, so that you can ramp up quickly, and you don't have to spend the first 6 months being a board member, just kind of staying silent and trying to catch up on where things are, because after an annual meeting and new board members are elected, the board picks up where they left off. It doesn't reset. So you need to make sure that you're prepared so that you can be an effective board member as soon as you step in there and start acting like a board member. I don't mean acting as, acting in that sense, but I mean being a board member and just being a part of that group and that decision-making process and what your responsibilities are. So I moved quickly because I wanted to save a few minutes for any Q&A. I don't see any other Q&A, so that either means I was boring and everyone fell asleep, or you were taking copious notes and using some of the things that were covered here today to help you become a more effective board meeting member, whether you're new or you're a veteran on the board. I think there's always opportunity to learn more about being a board member. And as I opened up, with the, every so often there's something that impacts our industry significantly. Well, 1,500 miles away from here, with that building collapse in Surfside, that's a wake-up call to boards, okay, as well as municipalities, as well as engineers. But I will tell you that the compliance requirements in New York, forgetting that buildings aren't built like that, and buildings are built on bedrock and on Manhattan as opposed to sand and marshland in Florida. We have one of the strictest building code requirements and compliance requirements, not only in the country, but in the world. So maybe that's a good place to end. And it's a point that I think will probably be covered next week during your Mary Ann's next session. And my partner, Michael Wolf, from First Service, will be on that panel next week. So
And
Mary
there's
Ann,
a whole new rash of questions. I'm not going to let you go. There are 3 or 4 more questions.
okay, no, we have time. Let me go down the line here and just see what we have. So what perspective is the checklist from? The new member or the existing board? I mean, so this is from our perspective, all right? And we've been doing this a long time, and we believe we have a good handle on what board members need. And as I said just a couple of minutes ago, we want existing board members to see this as well, because maybe there's something that they're missing. What size buildings are exempt from letter grades for the carbon footprint? It's 25,000 feet.
Under 25,000.
Yeah, so if you're under 25,000 feet, you don't have to, you're exempt, okay? Those are quote unquote the small buildings. Is the building super part of management or staff? What should the relationship between the board, managing agent, and super be? Okay, so I'm gonna real quick. To me, it's like a baseball team. Okay, your ownership. Okay, management's like the general manager, and your superintendent is your field manager. Okay, so he is the the manager of the team. Whether it's Luis Rojas, I'm a Met fan, or whoever's for the Yankees. But anyway, ownership should not be interfering with the staff, and the superintendent is responsible for the building staff, and the superintendent reports to the property manager, and the property manager reports to ownership. And if you keep that that structure in place, it will work very well, because when anyone has more than one boss, it creates a lot of chaos. Next question, with regard to COVID policies, like requiring face masks in elevators, who do you recommend to ensure compliance? Look, you know, a lot of this is the honor system, okay? We have it in our office now. If you are vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. If you're not vaccinated, you have to wear a mask, okay? There's some honor in that, okay? If you're unvaccinated and not wearing a mask and we find out, then we'll do something about it, okay? But again, you can't have the COVID police if you know, walking around the building. If somebody is, if you see somebody who doesn't have a mask, then say something to management and we'll deal with the resident directly. Does the board have a right to remove a homeowner's car if their common charges are delinquent? This is a very difficult city to evict anyone or anything, okay? I would consult with your association counsel to get guidance on that. That, you know, your declaration may have some information on that, but I would not do anything without counsel's advice. A couple more questions here, which I am happy to answer.
Question on management company versus or in partnership with the treasurer is still unclear as to what, how, and when. How much communication should there be?
Okay, so let's put this at a board level, okay? And I'm going to use the operating budget as an example. So the treasurer will work with the manager as well as our financial analyst in putting together a budget, okay? Maybe there's somebody else on the board. In some instances, there's a budget committee. That's few and far between. And what will happen is, between the financial analyst, our property manager, and the treasurer will come to some sort of a consensus for presenting to the board. And then that gets presented at the board, a board meeting, the next board meeting. The budget is given to them in advance, so they have an opportunity to review it. And they may have questions about it in advance, and that goes back to board meeting preparation. And then, you know, the treasurer and the property manager and possibly the financial analyst who are at the meeting will be able to answer questions that board members have, so that you can approve a budget and you can get out a communication to board members explaining, this is the budget, and here are the components that impacted, you know, a 2.5% increase, yada, yada, yada. Is the basement included in the count of the building stories? Okay, so, and I think this is related to local law 11. Just make sure I got all of it. And basically, there are clear definitions as to the difference between a basement and a cellar, okay? So, you know, if any portion of your basement is above grade, either in the front, side, or back of the building, then it's counted, okay? Or most likely it's counted. If it's, you know, underground all the way around, it's not considered part of counting the number of floors. And that definition has changed within the last, I'll say, 4-5 years, to clarify the difference between a 6-story building with a cellar versus a 6-story building with a basement. Okay, and a basement, like in my house, the front of the house, you don't know where the basement is. In the back of the house, it's above grade because the property slopes. And we have that in several properties. It's Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens. I mean, there are plenty of those types of properties. Mary Ann, I think I ran out of one more question. I'm looking at the fire and emergency slide. I see all these LLs requiring posting a sign with information. We don't have this done at our condo. We are self-managed. Should we post these signs? So if you're self-managed, you have to make sure that you're in compliance, and there are things that need to be posted on the inside of apartment doors around fire safety. There are different types of fire safety notices that have to be distributed. Ones have, like, the same one is 2 years consecutively, and then there's a third one on the third year that's like a book. And so these are things that you need to know. If there's a fire in your building and there's not a decal on the back that is, an approved FDNY decal, and something happens, you're going to be liable as a board, and you do not want.
There's a wonderful book that every self-managed building should buy at least every couple of years, called the Apartment Management Checklist, which goes through all these requirements, shows you what the law requires. There are also services that will help you develop your fire safety plan and distribute it periodically to your shareholders.
So I think, Mary Ann, you just answered the last two questions that came up, because they were supplemental questions to the initial question. So, and
yes, contact me, Mary.
Yeah, I don't have any of those apartment checklists. I mean, I do, but we're third party. So for those of you who are self-managed, I wish you all the luck, but just make sure that you are covering this stuff, because I can't really emphasize how important it is. And it becomes important when you have a fire in the building, or something happens with one of your gas lines and you didn't follow the compliance around that. And that's where, that's where board members, all of a sudden you realize you don't have any insurance for that, and you're personally liable. Mary Ann,
yes.
Do you want to close this out?
I do. I want to thank you very much for another terrific seminar in our tradition of onboarding new board members. Are you in agreement to share the slides with people? Because
what we do, okay, is we put our basically the entire presentation on our website, for anyone to go on and see. I think that's
and that website is?
Well, it's just firstserviceresidential.com, okay? And you can put it up on your website as well, and we'll have it up within, let's say, a week to 10 days, so that anybody could look at it. So you don't have to be a client of First Service to access our library of webinars, and this will be included as one of them.
Excellent.
Because I don't believe that the deck itself does justice without the verbiage behind it, and that's why we do it this way.
Well put. So again, our thanks, and a little bit of applause on behalf of everyone. It's always a great seminar, and I learn things each time. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining and for enjoying this class.
And thank you as well. I appreciate everyone's participation this evening, and enjoy the rest of your summer, and stay well and safe.
You too. Thanks.
Okay. Bye, everyone.